Hey everyone, this is Louis7, and today I have a starter build for the Line Minstrel in the Lord of the Rings Online. As we build the Line Minstrel, some themes to look out for include any traits that impact our cries and calls, which are going to be our biggest source of damage, especially while leveling, as well as any traits that impact the ballad and coda system, which typically comes into play in extended combat. And while this is the current build that I have on this character, we will be building for the starter build just 50 trait points to help you get started with the Line Mini. So let's go ahead and re-specialize, and as we spec into Line, we do get a couple abilities. First, we get one of our anthems. This is going to be the anthem that you can only get from speccing in the Line. It of course is very helpful to us increasing our cry and call damage, as well as giving the Fellowship a little bit of tactical damage. We also get the active ability Called to Fate, which will be one of our strongest abilities at low level, and it just does a lot of damage to a single target. We also say we get some extra bonuses for various abilities here and light type damage. By the way, all of our damage is light type, so that is something that we also need to look out for. But let's go ahead and specialize in and start looking at the traits. So in the first row, we'll notice we have ballad and coda damage as one of the optional traits. Now the problem with this one is we typically prefer our cries and calls as they are more effective. Piercing Cry is actually one of our main abilities as a minstrel. One of the reasons is because it is immediate, so you can actually use it to animation cancel, which basically means that you get to cut the animation time of another ability short and essentially get two effects in one. You get the Piercing Cry effect and the effect of the original ability, so you can use abilities with long animations in combination with Piercing Cry for overall faster damage, and of course that means faster leveling. I did want to point that out with Piercing Cry, but overall we probably will get this because boosting it will be helpful as we typically want to use it on cooldown anyway. Our last trait here is going to be fairly universal in that it increases our crit chance and crit multiplier. Compared to straight ballad and coda damage, this would probably be more helpful just because it impacts all of our abilities, and especially considering we primarily just need our cries and calls on landscape. So I'll put 1 point in Concussive Shout and then 4 points in this, and that will unlock our next row. And we have an active ability here, Call of Arome, so I will go ahead and put a point in that because that will be our best option. And then we also have a trait for cries and call damage, and putting 4 points in that will unlock the third row for us. So that has been straightforward, but now we are stuck with a few options, and one that I want to highlight first that I'm not going to be putting points in is going to be Enduring Morale. If you are in situations where you feel like you need a survivability boost, and especially the AoE stun that you can get for Call of the Second Age. Call of the Second Age is a close range AoE ability that admittedly does a lot of damage. You can get a stun effect on that by putting up to 3 points in Enduring Morale, and then increase the duration of that by going up to the full 5 points. So if you ever want that utility and survivability, I recommend just putting points in Enduring Morale. But for the purposes of this build, I typically haven't found on my leveling minstrel that I need it all that much, so I'd rather just boost my damage, and one of the great ways to do that is going to be improving Call of Arome to impact more targets, and of course just gives it more damage. Now if you're wondering what Call of Arendelle here is, when you go into the Resonance stance, which is the healing stance, Call of Arome will turn into Call of Arendelle. It will have a somewhat similar effect, but that is going to be the healing stance version of it. Typically we're going to be in War Speech, or rather Dissonance stance, as a Line Minstrel, or occasionally Melody stance, depending on what we are doing and what we are hoping to achieve in combat. But yes, Call of Arome, that is how I'm going to refer to this ability. Anyway, we'll go ahead and put 2 points in that to increase the targets. That'll increase it from 3 to 7, which will be very nice for AoE. Otherwise, for our other trait in this row, we have our ballad abilities have a chance to build a stacking enhancement for Coda of Fury. Ultimately, this trait is something that's going to very slowly build up over time in combat, and eventually you will need 3 points into it to even get the guarantee for the 5% damage buff, and that requires you to go through your ballads and codas, and typically, again, all you need are your cries and calls in short duration fights. Eventually long duration fights we will use ballads, But at this point, I'll go ahead and backfill 1 point in Discordant Cries and then 1 point in the overall Critical Strikes trait. And that leaves us with 1 trait point, which I'll go ahead and fill with Ballad and Coda damage. Would rather that overall than 1 point in Emboldening Finish to improve our overall damage. But that unlocks the next row. And in this row, we have just straight up light damage. So that's going to impact all of our abilities equally, which is nice. And we also have the Active Anthem ability. So typically I would prefer to put a point in the Active Anthem ability and get that, but sometimes you might find yourself never actually using the Anthem, and you could technically save a trait point by not putting a point in that. But if you're in any decent duration fights and you actually find yourself maintaining your anthems regularly, again, we got the regular Dissonance Anthem, then that is definitely worth putting a point in, and I'll put a point in it here for completeness. Also, one thing I do want to point out is you might notice my anthem there has a longer duration than what you would typically have at this low level, and that's because when you get to your legendary items especially, they can increase the duration of anthems. So that's something you might not see until a little bit higher level, and that's even if you have the tracery for that. But I did want to point that out in case you notice the difference in duration on the anthem. Also, another mechanic to point out at this point is going to be how the 2 Dissonance Anthems interact. So Anthem of War and your Dissonance Anthem will actually get a combined buff if you maintain both of those anthems at once. So if you're able to weave in both of these Anthem abilities, you only need to use one of them, it does not matter which, to maintain that combined buff. But anyway, at this point, we'll probably want to just fill out straight light type damage because, again, that impacts everything, including our cries and calls, which are going to get even better at higher level, as we will see. But putting 4 points in that unlocks the next row. Now, with this next row, I will not be putting 2 points in either of these traits immediately. The big thing with Dissonant Strike is it's just not all that great of an ability. You would rather not use that. You'd prefer, if your cries and calls are on cooldown, you'd prefer to go through the Ballad, Anthem, and Coda system. And as far as the effects that this trait give with the Morale Stolen, you have to get a critical hit on the enemy to even get that Morale Stolen, and it's honestly not all that great. And even for the 6th rank, stealing the mitigation does not really do all that much for you. So we will not be putting points on that. And Echoes of Battle has recently, with the Minstrel rework, actually been buffed, so it can be worth using in combat, especially longer fights if you're, say, targeting an elite, like this enemy that is behind me. But in regular combat on the landscape, I still don't find it actually worth spending my time to even use that ability, because if it gets 1 or 2 dot ticks, that's still not as good as just using a regular ability for straight up damage up front. Typically, I would only consider this worth using if it gets at least 4 dot ticks, which requires the enemy to survive for 12 seconds, which is actually a long time. So that's why I don't typically end up actually using Echoes of Battle in combat, but it does have that use. But this is all a long-winded way to say I'm going to backfill 1 point in Song of Arda, and then we'll have to actually go back to our Ballad and Coda damage, which putting 3 points in that actually unlocks a new trait for us, which I'll get to in a moment. And we would have to put 2 more points after that to unlock the next row. So now that we have this new Piercing Ballad trait unlocked, it is appropriate to look at it, and comparing 5% Ballad and Coda damage to 3% Ballad crit chance plus the finesse bonus, which isn't a particularly impressive amount of finesse, but it is something that helps. We would rather put 2 points in Piercing Ballads for the crit chance. Now, in general, in LOTRO, a very rough estimate is that 1% crit chance is roughly equal to 2% damage. That does, of course, vary by class, even by spec, and even just what stats your characters have. But that's a start for an estimate if you're just looking for a quick comparison between just a straight up damage boost and a crit chance boost. So with that, this crit chance does outweigh the damage that the previous trait provides, plus it gives us the finesse, is why I prioritize that. But this does unlock for us the next row, and with that, the leftmost trait just increases our Cry and Call critical multiplier. Crit damage is, of course, a big theme with the Red Line Minstrel, so that definitely seems like it will be valuable. And we also have improved Coda of Fury, which is really interesting because we can get up to a 50% chance for the Coda to actually reset our Cry and Call cooldowns. And of course, we want to use our cries and calls as frequently as possible, so if the Coda resets that, that's very beneficial for us. So at this point, I'll put 1 point in Pierce Cries, then all 3 points in improved Coda of Fury, and that leaves us with 1 point to backfill and Piercing Ballads to unlock the last row. And the last row is really exciting. largely because of this single ability. It's a new Cry ability. It does have a 30-second cooldown, but it's going to become one of our main abilities in our active rotation. It does some great AoE burst damage, is something you will notice. And also at a similar point here, when you unlock this set bonus for Cry of the Valor, that's going to be just another AoE that we get for our Redline Minstrel that really helps our damage. We'll get to the rest of the set bonuses later, but I thought I would point that out, that you actually get these at similar time, and you will probably notice a significant boost to your AoE damage output around this point. The other capstone trait that we will have in this row is called Echoes, and it basically makes our cries and calls deal damage over time. There is only a 33% application chance, but if you're using your cries and calls frequently, that will apply often, and it stacks up to 3 times. This is going to be something that is kind of similarly slowly built up over time as some of our previous traits, but it is going to be helpful overall, and for only 1 trait point, I will go ahead and pick that over our other options. So at this point, we have spent 32 trait points, and we have gone to the bottom of the red line. We have options to either go into the yellow line or backfill in the red line, and I here would go ahead and start backfilling into the red line, at least finishing Piercing Ballads and the fundamentals. As usual, I do want to highlight that this is just a starter build, and I recommend you change it to fit your playstyle as you see fit with the traits. This especially gets true for the Minstrel. When you get to these higher levels and start diving into the yellow line, you can choose a lot more support oriented traits, or you can choose more damage oriented traits. For this starter build, as a Redline Minstrel, that's typically what we would use while leveling up, so I am going to be going for a more damage oriented and solo oriented build. But again, I recommend paying attention to some yellow line traits if you do play in a group and do play Redline in a group, to see if some of those might interest you, such as these anthems. But with that said, for the purposes of this build, I accidentally went ahead and clicked 3 points into that. I'll go ahead and finish out Emboldening Finish, and then I will dive into the yellow line. Now is also another great time to highlight Enduring Morale if you do want the benefit from that with the AoE stun and survivability with the increased max morale. It's definitely helpful. You're basically sacrificing a little bit of damage for a somewhat decent boost to survivability for that trait. Since I tend to roll a glass cannon, I will go ahead and dive into the yellow line to start boosting my damage a little bit more. Now, we don't really have anything that's honestly exciting in the first row as a Redline Minstrel, unless you want some more of the support-oriented stuff. So Memories of Battle is the only thing that's really going to help our damage. And it honestly doesn't do that all that much. It just gives a little bit of resistance debuff with the Echoes of Battle. It strengthens that debuff a little bit, and that's honestly not all that much of a benefit, but compared to the other things, it is the only one that's really helpful for us, except for Anthem of Composure. I'll go ahead and get Lesser Anthem 3 Composure just to have that, because it's really the only thing that stands out among all 4 of these traits. And it's something I would typically not use in combat, but good to know I have it if I do want a little bit of tactical mitigation buff. But with 4 points in that, we have unlocked the next row, and here's where we get to actually some other exciting things. And I think the biggest thing that we do want is 1 point in Thunderous Codas to unlock the benefit of Coda of Fury. That's the one when we're in Dissonant stance. Coda of Fury will just deal a little bit of damage. It's like a time bomb. After you apply Coda of Fury, it will do a similar damage attack a few seconds. I believe it's like 3 seconds after that. So you get extra damage out of Coda of Fury, which is really nice. You also do have a little bit of extra benefit for your Coda in the other stances, but we'll put 1 point in that just to unlock the effect. Now, as for the Coda buff potency, that's something that would eventually be helpful, but if we're prioritizing our precious trait points here, we only have 3 more points until we're at the end of the build. We would rather just straight up boost our damage, so this would be up to 9% tactical damage, and that would give us 50 trait point spend and be the end of the starter build, which would be level 70, just for reference. So I will go ahead and apply that, but just to point out further in the build, there are a lot of other yellow line traits, but some particular ones to highlight is just straight up increased tactical mastery and eventually tactical mitigation. There's also this very valuable trait. We do get the crit chance of ballads, but the one that is locked in that branch is going to be sharing a story. So when you get a critical hit with a ballad, that will reset the piercing cry cooldown, which is very, very valuable, because I mentioned earlier that the piercing cry itself is very valuable because it is an immediate ability and you can use it to animation cancel. So if you're resetting the cooldown on that more frequently, you can use it more frequently and essentially animation cancel more frequently and get a lot more attacks per minute or boost your APM. I guess if you're a minstrel, that's kind of like just having a faster BPM. But anyway, let's go ahead and move on to the next section of this build, which is going to be on virtue traits. And unfortunately, this character has 0 virtue. She is just not virtuous, but we can still cover what I would use. Of course, the Red Line Minstrel follows my standard DPS choice. If you are interested in more information, I'd recommend checking out my virtue guide, but this is what I would have with loyalty. And then below that, honesty and wit are great options for damage. You also have wisdom and confidence as well. If you're looking for some more defensive virtues that might also be helpful if you're looking to be a little bit more flexible with healing, you could also opt for something like fidelity and charity. But again, this is just a starting point with the virtues. And that will be it for this 50 trait point starter build guide for the Red Line Minstrel. I hope this guide was helpful for you all as a starting point for your music machines of destruction. And if you haven't yet, please consider liking and subscribing for more, or becoming a channel member to support the content and get early access to guides like this. And thanks for watching, everyone.